Imagine walking out of your front door tomorrow morning and you find out that it is completely legal for your city to arrest someone just for sleeping outside with a blanket.
Even if there isn't a single shelter bed available anywhere near them.
Right, like not a single bed within a 50-mile radius.
Right.
For years, that specific scenario was totally unconstitutional across a huge portion of the United States.
Yeah, local governments were bound by this really strict equation. If you couldn't offer a person a bed indoors, you just couldn't clear their tent from the sidewalk.
Exactly. But in June 2024, the United States Supreme Court completely obliterated that equation.
They really did. I mean, the legal framework that governed public space and extreme poverty, it was essentially rewritten overnight.
Yeah, mayors, police departments, outreach organizations, they all just woke up to this new reality where the main barrier to enforcing anti-camping laws had completely vanished.
Which triggered a really immediate, aggressive shift in how major cities handle their unhoused populations.
Right. So that's what we're looking at today. We are putting a massive stack of sources on the table to understand exactly what is happening on the ground in the wake of that ruling.
We've got the text of the Supreme Court decision itself, some pretty aggressive new executive orders from state governors.
Multi-billion-dollar municipal budget analyses.
Yeah, and the latest empirical data from researchers who are actually studying the direct outcomes of these homelessness interventions.
So the mission for this deep dive is to basically strip away all the political rhetoric. We want to look strictly at the mechanics of how different cities are responding to street homelessness.
Right, contrasting the enforcement-heavy sweeps that we're seeing in California right now against the legally binding shelter guarantee model that completely defines New York City.
And the stakes here, I mean, they go way beyond abstract policy. We're looking at a collision between preserving public order for local communities and, well, protecting the foundational civil liberties for individuals who have lost everything.
Yeah, it really requires us to look at the reasoning of the people who are actually navigating this on the ground.
Right, like the business owners dealing with open encampments.
Exactly, or the civil rights attorneys defending the unhoused, and the economists who are tracking the data.
So we're not taking sides here. We are going to examine the empirical evidence to determine what interventions actually permanently reduce homelessness.
And which ones simply shuffle the crisis from one neighborhood to another, at an enormous cost to the taxpayer.
Yeah, and regardless of where you live, whether you're commuting through downtown San Francisco or you live in a quiet Midwestern suburb, the precedents being set in these major urban centers right now, they dictate how your tax dollars are deployed.
They really do. And how the legal system defines the baseline standards of human survival.
Exactly. These policies inevitably ripple out to shape state and federal law. So, to understand the current reality, we have to start with the legal earthquake that made it all possible. Let's look at the precedent that governed the West Coast before the Supreme Court stepped in. I'm talking about the 2018 ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, Martin v. Boise.
Yeah, Martin v. Boise. To really grasp the magnitude of the 2024 reversal, you have to understand the specific constitutional logic of that case.
Right. And the Ninth Circuit oversees the western states, which is where the street homelessness crisis is most visually acute, mostly due to weather and insane housing costs.
Exactly. So in this case, the city of Boise, Idaho, was actively issuing criminal citations to individuals just for sleeping on public property.
And the plaintiffs argued that these citations violated the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Right, the one prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment. And the Ninth Circuit actually agreed with them.
Because of a really specific biological reality, right?
Yeah. The court recognized that sleep is not optional. I mean, it's a universal, involuntary biological necessity.
You literally cannot legislate away the human need to rest.
No, you can't. So the legal phrasing centered on punishing an involuntary condition. The court's logic was that if a city fails to provide an available shelter bed, then an unhoused person has literally no alternative but to sleep on public property.
Right. So punishing them for an involuntary act, sleeping, when there's no legal alternative, is tantamount to criminalizing their actual status as a homeless person.
Exactly. You're effectively punishing them simply for existing within the city limits without property.
And this created the famous no bed, no ban rule.
Yes.
Which turned encampment management into this daily mathematical paralysis for local governments. I mean, imagine a neighborhood association calling the mayor's office, furious about a huge encampment blocking a sidewalk.
Right, and the city would look at their shelter inventory, realize they were at 100% capacity.
And their hands were tied.
Totally tied.
Yeah.
If they sent police to clear the camp without offering beds, they faced massive federal civil rights lawsuits.
But cities argued this created an impossible administrative bottleneck. They claimed this ruling allowed temporary encampments to harden into these permanent, unregulated shantytowns.
Yeah, with severe sanitation and safety issues. They felt legally blocked from enforcing even basic public health codes because any enforcement could be seen by a federal judge as a violation of the Martin precedent.
But then, that paralysis broke completely on June 28, 2024.
The legal earthquake.
Right. The Supreme Court issued its 6-3 ruling in City of Grants Pass v. Johnson, and they fundamentally dismantled the Martin precedent.
So Grants Pass is this municipality in Oregon, and they took a highly aggressive legislative approach. They passed ordinances specifically prohibiting people from sleeping on public property with the use of bedding.
Right. So if you fell asleep on a bench in a nice suit, you might be fine. But if you use a sleeping bag or a blanket or even just a piece of cardboard to insulate yourself from the freezing concrete,
then you were subject to escalating civil fines, and those could eventually trigger criminal trespass charges and jail time.
wow. And the Ninth Circuit had previously struck down those Grants Pass ordinances using the Martin logic.
They did. But the Supreme Court majority, in an opinion written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, ruled that the ordinances were entirely constitutional.
Okay, so what was his reasoning there?
Well, the pivot in Gorsuch's legal reasoning is highly technical, but it's crucial. He argued that the Eighth Amendment was historically designed to restrict the methods of punishment the state can inflict.
Like torture or hard labor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not to restrict what specific types of conduct a local government can classify as a crime.
So the majority basically argued that Grants Pass wasn't targeting the status of being homeless. They were regulating the conduct of camping on public land.
Right. That's the exact distinction Gorsuch drew. He argued that the camping ban applies equally across the board. So a wealthy college student on a road trip who decides to pitch a tent in a city park is theoretically subject to the exact same fines as a chronically unhoused resident.
Because the law targets the act of camping with bedding, not the identity of the person doing it.
Exactly. So Gorsuch concluded it doesn't criminalize the status of homelessness. He also spent a lot of the opinion talking about the practical chaos he felt the Ninth Circuit had inflicted on cities.
He didn't think federal judges should be micromanaging local public space policies based on, shifting shelter bed counts.
Right.
But I'm looking at the dissent from Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, and she completely attacks that status versus conduct distinction.
Yeah, she calls it a legal fiction.
Right. She says it's completely divorced from biological reality. She points out that by outlawing the use of a blanket, the city is criminalizing the only safe way a homeless person can fulfill the biological necessity of sleep.
Sotomayor argued that the ordinances were intentionally designed to push the unhoused population out of Grants Pass entirely.
Right. I mean, if you acknowledge that a person must sleep and you acknowledge they have nowhere indoors to go, banning them from using a blanket to survive the night outdoors is a direct criminalization of their existence.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. The majority's logic is basically saying the law is like a strict speed limit, right? Everyone has to drive 55 miles per hour, whether you're in a rusted sedan or a luxury sports car.
Right, it's a neutral rule governing conduct.
But Sotomayor's dissent effectively counters that it's more like passing a law against breathing in a public park, knowing full well that a specific subset of the population has absolutely no private property to retreat to for air.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great way to frame it.
Like, labeling it a neutral conduct rule doesn't change the fact that it exclusively punishes people for just being alive without real estate.
Well, both of these constitutional interpretations, they stem from fundamentally different views of the judiciary's role in local governance. The majority prioritized municipal authority and public order.
Right, and the dissent prioritized protecting vulnerable individuals against state action.
But the immediate practical implication was absolute. The Supreme Court removed the constitutional barrier. Cities no longer needed to prove they had an available shelter bed before sending in law enforcement to dismantle an encampment.
But here's the thing. Answering the constitutional question doesn't answer the policy question.
Right.
Just because the Supreme Court ruled that clearing encampments without offering shelter is legal doesn't mean the data shows it actually works to reduce homelessness.
No, not at all.
And to test that, we have to look at the immediate aftermath, because California did not wait a single second to use this new legal authority.
No, they really didn't.
Yeah.
Within weeks of the Grants Pass ruling, on July 25, 2024, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order directing all state agencies to begin clearing encampments on state lands.
He demanded urgency.
Total urgency. And the state rapidly mobilized an entire bureaucratic infrastructure to execute these clearances at a massive scale.
Right. Early the following year, California launched the Safe Task Force State Action for Facilitation on Encampments,
which was designed to coordinate these massive sweep operations across the state's major urban centers, partnering with cities like LA, San Diego, and San Francisco.
And the scale of this displacement is just staggering. Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, which oversees the land next to highways, they reported clearing over 19,000 encampments on state rights-of-way since 2021.
19,000?
Yeah, and that trend dramatically accelerated post-ruling.
Right. Now, to understand why a state would invest such massive resources into enforcement, we really have to look at the strongest, most data-backed arguments for prioritizing public order.
Yeah, let's steelman the enforcement argument.
Okay. The proponents of these aggressive sweeps, they aren't simply acting out of malice. They're responding to a profound breakdown in civic function. Neighborhood groups, business associations, residents of lower-income areas, they argue that tolerating sprawling, unregulated encampments is a failure of government duty.
Because these aren't just, isolated individuals sleeping quietly in a park.
No. Over time, large encampments often evolve into complex, highly hazardous environments.
Right, we're talking about accumulations of biohazardous waste, rampant fire hazards from unregulated cooking,
and deeply entrenched open-air drug markets. Furthermore, the environmental justice aspect here is critical.
How so?
Well, these massive encampments are rarely located in affluent, highly resourced neighborhoods with strong political influence.
Right, of course.
They're disproportionately concentrated in working-class and lower-income communities. So the residents of these neighborhoods bear the brunt of the sanitation and safety hazards. They're effectively carrying the cost of the state's inability to house its population.
Yeah, that makes sense. And enforcement advocates also argue that leaving people to deteriorate on the streets is the opposite of compassion.
Exactly. They argue that when individuals are deep in the grip of synthetic fentanyl addiction or suffering from severe, untreated psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, they lose the capacity to voluntarily seek help.
So the argument is that you need the structured pressure of an encampment sweep to break that deadly inertia.
Right. The theory is that if you pair a police citation with an offer of services or a referral to California's care court system, you can force an intervention.
Right, the Care Court, Community Assistance, Recovery, and Empowerment Court. That's a specific mechanism California designed just for this purpose.
Yeah. It allows family members, or first responders, or behavioral health workers to petition a civil court to actually compel a treatment plan for individuals with severe psychotic disorders.
So the enforcement perspective argues that without that initial shock to the system, the sweep, these individuals will never interface with the care court or the outreach workers trying to save them.
That's the argument, yeah.
Okay, I understand the theory of structured pressure. But when we look at the reality of how a sweep actually functions on the ground, the civil liberties advocates present a pretty crushing counterargument.
They do.
They argue that the mechanics of a sweep actively sabotage a person's ability to ever escape homelessness. I mean, if police and sanitation trucks arrive at an encampment with a bulldozer, what is actually happening to the people living there?
The logistical reality is often highly, highly chaotic. Despite official policies requiring advance notice, the execution on the street frequently results in individuals losing all of their possessions.
And we aren't just talking about sentimental items here.
No. It involves the destruction of vital structural documents required to navigate the modern economy.
Right, state IDs, birth certificates, social security cards. If an unhoused person loses their ID in a sanitation truck, the bureaucratic loop to replace it is a total nightmare.
It's nearly impossible. You usually need a birth certificate to get an ID and an ID to get a birth certificate.
Right, and both require a permanent mailing address.
Exactly. If you don't have those documents, you cannot apply for a job, you cannot sign a lease for an apartment, you can't access federal benefits. The sweep effectively resets their progress to zero.
Wow. And it's not just documents, right? Sweeps routinely result in the confiscation or destruction of vital medications.
Yeah, which plunges individuals into immediate medical or psychiatric crises. Outreach workers also report that sweeps destroy months of delicate relationship building.
I can imagine.
If a caseworker has spent 6 months earning the trust of an individual suffering from severe paranoia and finally convinces them to sign paperwork for an upcoming housing unit.
That progress is just vaporized if a sweep displaces the individual to some unknown part of the city.
Exactly. The caseworker loses contact and the whole process just fails.
So we had these two competing theories, the theory of structured pressure versus the theory of active sabotage. And we can actually test them by looking at the data generated by the SAFE task force itself.
Yes, let's look at the numbers.
If the enforcement-heavy model works as intended, we should see thousands of individuals moving from encampments into stable environments. What do the numbers from California actually show?
Well, by January 2026, the SAFE task force's own data indicated that across its highly publicized early operations, only about 108 people had accepted and successfully entered shelter.
Wait, really? 108 people?
Yes, out of thousands who were displaced across the state.
That is, if a task force is executing massive, expensive, highly coordinated sweeps, and only 108 people are actually moved indoors,
Yeah.
where are the rest of them going?
They're just moving. You clear a block in downtown Los Angeles, the people scatter, and 2 days later they set up tents 3 blocks away.
And then the businesses in the new location demand a sweep, and the whole cycle just repeats itself.
It is a perpetual motion machine fueled by tax dollars. It generates displacement without creating a single new housing outcome.
So if California demonstrates that aggressively displacing people without a destination is ultimately just, a tragic game of musical chairs,
Right.
the natural question is, what happens if a city legally forces itself to provide that destination?
Yes.
What if a municipality mandates that no one can legally be denied a roof? That takes us to the East Coast and the deeply complex reality of New York City's shelter system.
Yeah, New York City is fascinating because they operate under a legal paradigm that exists almost nowhere else in the United States. It's governed by a 1981 consent decree from a lawsuit known as Callahan v. Carey.
Right.
The court mandated that the city provide temporary shelter for any eligible person who requests it. This is the famous right to shelter.
And a consent decree is a profound legal mechanism. It doesn't just suggest a policy. It binds the city legally and financially to a specific outcome.
Exactly. If New York City fails to provide a bed to someone who asks, they are in violation of federal court order.
So the municipal budget basically has to absorb the cost of housing people, regardless of the fiscal climate.
Right. And visually, the results are undeniable. When you compare the streets of Manhattan to San Francisco, the volume of visible street encampments is drastically lower in New York.
Because the right to shelter establishes a baseline floor of physical survival. It actively suppresses visible street homelessness.
Yes, when individuals know there is a guaranteed, legally protected space for them indoors, a massive portion of the vulnerable population will actually utilize it.
But the requirement to guarantee a bed on demand places a near-infinite liability on a finite municipal budget.
And that is exactly where the system buckled. The fiscal stress test of this legal guarantee reached a breaking point starting around 2022.
Right, because New York City experienced a massive influx of well over 100,000 asylum seekers and migrants.
Yeah, because the Callahan decree historically applied to anyone requesting shelter, the city was suddenly legally obligated to secure housing for a population size it had never modeled or budgeted for.
So the logistical strain just pushed the city's infrastructure to the brink of collapse. The city was forced to rent out entire blocks of luxury hotels at premium nightly rates.
They constructed massive, sprawling tent cities and parking lots and authorized billions of dollars in emergency spending outside standard procurement processes.
The burn rate was entirely unsustainable for local taxpayers, which eventually forced the city to negotiate a reduction in its own legal obligations, right?
Yes. In March 2024, the City of New York and the Legal Aid Society reached a major settlement to modify the right to shelter in response to the crisis.
So what did they change?
They implemented strict time limits. Most single adult migrants were restricted to 30 days in the shelter system, while those under 23 were given 60 days.
Got it. So they maintained the principle of the decree, but conceded that a physical and financial guarantee has hard limits when demand spikes uncontrollably.
Right. So the New York model empirically proves two things simultaneously. Guaranteeing a bed works to clear the streets, but attempting to honor that guarantee without massive federal support can paralyze a major metropolis financially.
But there's another layer here, too. We have to examine why the right to shelter doesn't achieve 100% compliance.
Yeah, this is crucial.
Because even before the migrant crisis, thousands of individuals in New York actively chose to sleep on freezing sidewalks or ride the subway system all night rather than invoke their right to a guaranteed bed.
Yeah. If a bed is guaranteed, why would someone choose the street? We have to look at the mechanics of what the city is actually offering.
Right, because when we hear the word shelter, we might picture, a small private room.
But the reality of a massive municipal system is the congregate shelter model.
Okay, so explain a congregate shelter.
A congregate shelter often consists of a massive open space, a gymnasium, an armory, or a warehouse, and it's filled with dozens or hundreds of cots paced inches apart.
Wow.
For an individual experiencing homelessness, crossing the threshold of a congregate shelter requires surrendering almost every aspect of their personal autonomy.
Right, the facility dictates when the lights go out, when meals are served, when you have to leave in the morning.
Exactly. But it's the sensory and physical environment that really drives people away. Imagine you're suffering from acute PTSD, or you're neurodivergent, or you're recovering from a violent assault on the street.
Okay.
You're placed in a massive echoing room with 200 strangers. Some of those strangers may be actively experiencing psychotic breaks. Some may be deeply intoxicated.
The sensory overload alone would be paralyzing.
It is. Furthermore, congregate shelters frequently ban pets, which forces people to abandon their only source of emotional comfort or physical protection.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
They often segregate by gender, meaning couples are forced to separate, and the lack of secure storage means theft of shoes, documents, and whatever minimal possessions they have is rampant.
So individuals are making a deeply rational, self-protective calculation.
Exactly. They determine that the physical exposure of sleeping under a bridge is actually less dangerous and less psychologically damaging than the volatile, hyperstimulating environment of a massive congregate facility.
Wow. So while a shelter guarantee dramatically reduces street homelessness, congregate environments ensure the crisis is never fully resolved.
Right.
This leaves mayors across the country staring at a brutal binary. California proves you can't enforce your way out of the problem without beds, and New York proves that guaranteeing beds can bankrupt you while still leaving the most traumatized individuals on the street.
So cities have begun desperately engineering interim fixes, tools designed to bridge the gap between a sidewalk and a permanent apartment.
Let's examine those, specifically the mechanics of sanctioned encampments in tiny home villages.
Yeah, so sanctioned encampments, also known as managed camps, represent a municipal concession to reality. If a city can't afford to build structures, and sweeping encampments just moves them around, the city instead designates a specific fenced parcel of municipal land where outdoor camping is legally permitted.
So it provides the order of a shelter without the roof.
Right. The city brings in portable toilets, hand washing stations, regular trash pickup to prevent biohazard accumulation, and on-site security to mitigate violence.
And crucially, it allows outreach workers to find their clients in the same place every single day.
Exactly. But the sanctioned encampment model triggers intense debate regarding the normalization of extreme poverty.
Right. Critics argue that by sanctioning outdoor living, local governments are institutionalizing a standard of living reminiscent of the Hoovervilles of the Great Depression.
Yeah, they question whether providing a porta potty and a chain-linked fence allows society to declare the problem managed, fundamentally lowering the bar for human dignity in the wealthiest nation on Earth.
And the data tracking whether these camps serve as a springboard to permanent housing or simply become permanent holding pens, it remains deeply inconclusive right today.
Yes, which is why the political momentum has shifted heavily toward the second interim fix: tiny home villages or non-congregate cabin communities.
And the appeal here directly addresses the failures of the New York congregate shelter model.
Yeah.
A tiny home is exactly what it sounds like: a highly compact, prefabricated structure, often just 64 to 100 square feet, with a bed, climate control, and maybe a desk.
But the critical technological advancement of a tiny home isn't the square footage, it's the door.
The door.
A lockable door fundamentally alters the psychological dynamic for an unhoused individual. It restores autonomy. A person can secure their belongings without fear of theft, they can bring their partner, they can bring their dog, and they can control their sensory environment.
So outreach workers report that individuals who will aggressively refuse a cot in an armory will frequently accept a key to a tiny home.
Exactly. And when Mayer looks at the economics, it seems like a miracle solution. A city can purchase and assemble a prefabricated cabin for tens of thousands of dollars in a matter of weeks.
Right. Contrast that with the staggering reality of building permanent, traditional, affordable housing in a state like California.
The economic bottleneck in permanent housing is severe. Constructing a single Unit 1 apartment door of permanent supportive housing in California currently averages roughly $650,000 and frequently exceeds that.
Okay, wait. How is it mathematically possible that a modest one-bedroom apartment costs $650,000 to build?
It is the compounding result of the regulatory and economic environment. You have exorbitant urban land costs. You have incredibly complex local zoning codes that require endless redesigns.
Right.
You have state mandates requiring developers to pay prevailing union wages for construction. You have escalating costs of raw building materials. But most significantly, you have the weaponization of environmental and neighborhood review processes.
NIMBism. Not in my backyard.
Yes. Neighborhood associations use laws like the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, to file endless lawsuits against affordable housing projects, claiming the building will cast shadows, or create traffic, or ruin neighborhood character.
And these lawsuits drag projects out for years, right? The legal fees and the carrying costs of the land during those delays inflate the final price tag exponentially, resulting in that $650,000 figure.
Exactly. So mayors view tiny homes as an emergency bypass to this completely broken system.
But the empirical outcomes of these tiny home villages tell a much darker story. They're designed to be temporary waiting rooms, but the actual data shows they are struggling to transition people into permanent stability.
Yeah, look at the specific data from a major tiny home village project in San Jose.
Right. The San Jose data revealed that only about 30% of the individuals who exited the tiny home program successfully transitioned into permanent housing.
Only 30%. The overwhelming majority either returned to the streets, entered other temporary holding patterns, or were incarcerated.
Furthermore, the deployment of these cabins is frequently derailed by the exact same bureaucratic friction that delays permanent housing.
Yeah, Governor Newsom heavily publicized a promise to deploy 1,200 tiny homes across the state, but the initiative fell severely behind schedule as local municipalities fought over zoning, utility connections, and neighborhood opposition.
Wow. A nonprofit leader evaluating these programs summarized it perfectly. They said a non-congregate cabin beats a shelter cot every time, but a person is still fundamentally homeless when they live there.
That's entirely true. We are pouring immense political capital and funding into building vastly superior waiting rooms. But the doctor's office, the permanent housing required to actually end their homelessness, remains closed.
Because we cannot figure out how to build it efficiently.
Right. We've engineered a massive structural bottleneck.
So if physical infrastructure is either too slow to build, too expensive to scale, or fails to permanently resolve the crisis, researchers have begun asking a radical question. What if we bypass the physical infrastructure entirely? What if the most efficient intervention is to directly inject resources into the hands of the individual?
This takes us to the New Leaf Project. And this is a study that challenges every deeply entrenched cultural assumption society holds about poverty, addiction, and personal responsibility.
It really does. The study was conducted in Vancouver, Canada, orchestrated by Foundations for Social Change in partnership with researchers at the University of British Columbia.
The methodology was remarkably straightforward. The researchers identified 50 unhoused individuals and provided them with a one-time, unconditional lump sum cash grant of 7,500 Canadian dollars.
There were no spending requirements, no mandatory financial literacy classes, no strings attached whatsoever.
None. They then meticulously tracked the outcomes of those 50 individuals over a 12-month period, comparing their trajectory against a control group of unhoused individuals who did not receive the cash transfer.
Right. Now, if you ask the general public what will happen if you hand a homeless person $7,500 in cash, the dominant narrative is immediate and cynical.
Oh, absolutely. The assumption is that the funds will be instantly squandered on illicit drugs and alcohol, potentially leading to a fatal overdose.
It's rooted in a systemic distrust of the decision-making capacity of the poor. But the UBC researchers tracked the actual spending mechanics, and the data completely dismantled the stereotype.
It really did. The outcomes regarding housing stability were profound. The individuals who received the $7,500 cash transfer moved out of the shelter system and secured stable housing significantly faster than the control group.
How much faster?
On average, the cash recipients transitioned into housing in roughly 3 months, whereas the control group languished in the shelter system for 5 months.
2 months of difference might sound small to some, but that is 2 fewer months exposed to the trauma and instability of the shelter system.
Exactly. And when the researchers analyzed the receipts and bank data to see where the $7,500 actually went, they found it was almost entirely directed toward the mechanics of survival.
The capital was overwhelmingly deployed toward rent, securing food, and purchasing transit, like bus passes or necessary vehicle repairs, which are the absolute prerequisites for securing and maintaining employment.
Yes. But the most shocking data point directly refutes the primary fear of the public.
What happened to their spending on temptation goods?
Right. The researchers strictly monitored spending on alcohol, tobacco, and illicit drugs. The data revealed that the group receiving the $7,500 actually reduced their overall spending on those specific substances when compared to the control group that received nothing.
Wait, having a lump sum of cash actually reduced their substance use?
Yes. Which seems counterintuitive until you examine the psychology of extreme poverty.
Right, because if substance use is primarily a coping mechanism to numb the profound physiological and psychological stress of sleeping on the street and facing constant systemic rejection,
Then aggressively alleviating that immediate poverty removes the trigger for the coping mechanism. When you introduce financial security, the psychological need to escape reality decreases.
wow. Furthermore, the study generated a compelling argument for fiscal conservatives.
It did, because the cash recipients exited the municipal shelter system 2 months faster than the control group. The direct cash transfer ultimately saved the shelter system money.
The reduction in daily operational costs for the shelter beds exceeded the initial $7,500 investment.
It proved to be a net positive return for the taxpayer.
It is a stunning proof of concept. However, we must be absolutely rigorous about the methodology here. This study does not suggest that handing out cash solves the entirety of the street homelessness crisis.
No, and the reason lies in exactly how the researchers selected those 50 people. The caveats are essential.
What was their screening process?
Well, they explicitly selected individuals who were newly homeless people who had lost their housing relatively recently due to a sudden economic shock, like a medical emergency, an unexpected eviction, or a job loss.
Okay.
They intentionally screened out individuals suffering from long-term, profound psychiatric disorders and those in the grip of severe, deeply entrenched chemical dependency.
So the data proves that for a specific segment of the population, those whose homelessness is purely a function of a temporary lack of capital direct cash is vastly superior and vastly cheaper than forcing them to navigate a bureaucratic municipal shelter system.
Yes. But it does not prove that a lump sum of cash can scale to solve the crisis for the chronically unhoused population, the people who have been living on the sidewalks for a decade battling profound cognitive decline.
Right. It confirms direct cash transfers as a highly precise, highly effective tool for preventing short-term economic displacement from becoming long-term chronic homelessness.
But it is not a unilateral solution for the most visible and complex manifestations of the crisis.
Okay. We have analyzed the entire spectrum of interventions today. We've seen California's enforcement sweeps, New York's billion-dollar shelter guarantee, the logistical bottleneck of tiny homes, and the targeted success of Vancouver's cash transfers.
Yeah.
When we aggregate all of this empirical data, how do we establish a definitive verdict on what actually works?
To synthesize all of this, we really have to rely on the most comprehensive academic literature available, specifically the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness conducted by UCSF, alongside a broad array of randomized controlled trials.
Right.
This body of research crystallizes the entire debate by defining two entirely separate drivers of the crisis: scale and duration.
Scale versus duration. This is the central thesis that explains why our policies so often fail. Explain the mechanics of scale first.
Okay, the scale of homelessness dictates the sheer volume of individuals who lose their housing in a specific region. The data overwhelmingly proves that scale is driven almost entirely by structural economics.
Specifically, the ratio between local median income and local housing costs.
Exactly. When a region's housing market appreciates to a level where a minimum wage or fixed income individual can no longer mathematically afford rent, the pool of unhoused individuals inevitably expands. Structural economics dictate how many people fall into the street.
But the housing market doesn't explain the individual variances we see on the street. Like, why does one person lose their apartment and couch surf for a month before bouncing back, while another person loses their apartment and ends up living in a tent under an overpass for 7 years?
That variance is the duration, and duration is dictated by individual vulnerability. Profound trauma, untreated psychiatric illness and severe chemical addiction dictate who remains trapped on the street the longest.
Right. A person suffering from untreated schizophrenia cannot navigate a complex rental market or maintain employment, ensuring their duration of homelessness is chronic.
But the structural lack of affordable housing, the scale, ensures that even if that person receives world-class psychiatric treatment, there is physically nowhere for them to live once they are stabilized.
So, understanding that the crisis requires solving both the economic scale and the individual duration, what are the two most definitive findings from the data regarding the interventions we've discussed?
The first definitive finding directly indicts the enforcement-only model authorized by the Grants Pass ruling. Criminalization by itself does not reduce homelessness.
There's no statistical evidence that sweeps work.
None. The empirical research demonstrates that issuing citations, confiscating tents, or temporarily jailing individuals for sleeping outside has zero statistical impact on the total population of unhoused individuals in a region.
Because it doesn't alter the economic scale of housing costs.
Right, and it exacerbates the duration of individual illness by destroying medication and severing caseworker ties. Enforcement is exclusively a tool for managing the aesthetic visibility of public space. It is not a tool for reducing homelessness.
And the second definitive finding.
Housing reduces homelessness, specifically the Housing First model. Randomized controlled trials consistently demonstrate that providing permanent, subsidized housing without mandating prior sobriety or employment yields the highest rates of long-term housing stability.
When you secure the physical environment first, individuals are significantly more likely to engage with treatment, resulting in drastic reductions in emergency room utilization and criminal justice interactions.
Yes, but the UCSF study highlights a critical nuance here. You cannot address scale without addressing duration.
Meaning?
If a city simply hands an apartment key to an individual suffering from profound untreated psychosis and offers no further support, what happens?
The intervention fails.
Yes. Supplying housing without attaching rigorous wraparound psychiatric and social services fails the most deeply vulnerable individuals. They will almost certainly lose the housing.
Conversely, deploying armies of outreach workers and addiction counselors to the streets without having a permanent apartment to offer their clients fails everyone.
Exactly. You cannot therapy someone out of requiring a physical roof. Enforcement without a destination is mere geographical motion. Housing without services is structural abandonment.
We also have to acknowledge the frontiers of this crisis, where the data remains unresolved. I mean, we do not yet have long-term proof that sanctioned encampments function as anything more than static holding zones.
Right. We don't know if the direct cash transfer model can be adapted with behavioral guardrails to assist those with severe addictions.
And, looking at New York's near collapse during the migrant influx, it remains deeply questionable whether any major American city possesses the sheer fiscal endurance required to sustain a strict legal mandate to shelter every human being who requests it, absent massive federal intervention.
Yeah, the empirical verdict on the extremes is absolute. Pure law enforcement displacement resolves nothing, and permanent supportive housing resolves the core crisis.
But the chaotic, deeply contested middle ground, how a city successfully bridges the gap between an illegal encampment and a $650,000 apartment unit, that remains the defining civic challenge of our time.
It really does.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We analyzed how the Supreme Court's ruling in Grants Pass removed the constitutional requirement for available shelter beds, unleashing a wave of aggressive encampment sweeps across California.
We examined how those sweeps routinely destroy the vital documents necessary for individuals to escape the streets, resulting in massive displacement but negligible housing placement.
We contrasted that with New York's binding consent decree, which successfully suppresses visible street homelessness but pushed the municipal budget to the breaking point, driving a reliance on congregate armory shelters that many vulnerable individuals find too traumatic to endure.
We broke down the staggering economic bottlenecks that make permanent housing so difficult to build and analyzed how tiny home villages offer the crucial dignity of a locking door but struggle to transition people out of the system.
And we explored the paradigm-shifting data from Vancouver, proving that for those newly displaced by economics, direct financial capital is often the most precise and efficient intervention available.
But the unifying truth running through all of this data is that human vulnerability determines who gets stuck outside, while housing economics determines how many people fall out of the system in the first place.
Which brings us back to the most fundamental reality of this entire deep dive. We started by picturing a single tent on a sidewalk. The Supreme Court majority and the dissenting justices ultimately agreed on one inescapable biological fact.
Sleep is an involuntary necessity.
Every single human being currently living on the streets is going to have to lie down and close their eyes within the next 24 hours.
Right. And if the new legal standard allows cities to continuously mandate that these individuals relocate,
And if the bureaucratic reality dictates that building a single permanent apartment takes 5 years and over $500,000.
and if the existing congregate shelters are either at absolute capacity or represent a severe threat to a person's psychological safety.
Where physically is a human being supposed to exist tonight? Not when a new housing initiative finally breaks ground 3 years from now, but tonight. How a community chooses to answer that specific, immediate question, whether they answer it with a police citation, an armory cot, a tiny cabin, or a permanent apartment key, reveals everything about the values and the identity of that society. Thank you for joining this deep dive. Keep examining the data behind the headlines, keep questioning the simple narratives, and we'll see you next time.